So this is going to be an advanced talk. We'll see what that means. So, we're going to start with a quest. Our challenge, is to find the child components in a container and talk to them. Now, I actually have an example of the app. You'll have all the code. You'll be able to try it yourself. But basically, it shows a bunch of things that are animals and one thing that isn't. And you speak to the animals. Yes, the Vikings are animals. You're animals. You may also know this, what does the fox say? Ding, 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 right? Okay, so that's kind of a theme. Now, what we have is an outer container, represented here, the app animals container represented by app animals, and inside it can be any number of components that you might want to slide into your HTML. And some of them are animals, and some of them are not. And sometimes you could have arbitrarily repeated ones. So here we have more dogs. We have multiple dogs. Now each component is different. These are the rules for the challenge, all right? You've got to mentally follow along with this challenge. Your job is to find these animals and speak to them. The cat component, there's a dog component, a fox component, a rock component, Vikings, anything could happen. Some of them implement an interface called animal. Some of them extend, that is to say, they subclass the interface. How can that be? Pro tip, an abstract class can be an interface. This isn't true in any other of your languages, not your C's or your Javas. But you can, this means you can take a class, but you don't have to burn it as the base class for anything. You can just implement it. Implement it or extend it. This is actually particularly useful. Here's another pro tip. You've all probably said, I've got an object and it's not really a class and I need to provide it and I guess I'm going to have to use an injection token. I don't like injection tokens. I use them when I have to. But one of the things you found is that if you had done an interface like iAnimal, this didn't work because iAnimal, the interface just disappears. But if you do it as a class, you can use it as an injection token and it'll give shape to the things that you inject. So I try not to use injection tokens. I use abstract classes as interfaces quite often. They occupy no space. They're free. So here's one of the components. Remember, we're going to find them by interface, and yet the problem here is that Viking it implements the interface, actually, but it doesn't say it implements it. And yet I still want to talk to it. So you can see our challenge is getting kind of interesting here. How am I going to get to these things and talk to them? And I sure don't want to talk to the rock. All right, the rock isn't saying anything. So, again, find the animals and make them speak. Yes, that's anxiety, because it's not obvious how you do this. So we're going to try various things that people have asked me to try. Like we've heard maybe of @content children, the decorator that lets you find projected content inside your container. And one of the things we could try to do is find a component by its type. Well, we know it's Fox component, so we do that, and then after one of the lifecycle hooks, the content init, and we check, and yes, we've got foxes, and we can speak to the fox, and life is beautiful, except this only works for foxes. And it's kind of like we could try and do all the types and implement that in the container, but that's nuts. And besides, the container shouldn't know anything about it, so I don't think this is the solution we're looking for. Well, maybe what we could do instead is we could have each of the individual components that gets projected in talk to the container and say, hey, here I am. All right, how might we do that? And by the way, there's a real life example of this, which is, if you think about how the tab control works, you have a tab container, and the tabs inside it know that they register themselves with a tab container. So the thing is that we have this structure. We can see the structure. The outside there is the app animals, the container. So one of the things that people may not know, many of you know, but some of you may not, is that there isn't one injector in Angular. There was one injector in AngularJS, but in fact there is a hierarchy of injectors in Angular. And so it starts all the way up from platform when you start your application, and there's one of those on the screen. And then you have your application root when you bootstrap. But it turns out you could actually bootstrap multiple apps on the screen, so you might have a bunch of these. They all inherit from platform. So there needs to be that separation because, for example, the location service, you only want one of those on the page, right? If you're having the router, no matter how many apps you have on there, you only want it to listen to one. All right, and then your app module comes along. It has its Injector 2. And then your app component, and then your app container component, and finally you get down to cats and dogs. Now, at any of these levels, I can ask for some service. And if it's not in the injector I'm in, it goes to the next one up and says, have you got it? No. Next one, yeah, no. And if it runs out, then you get that dreaded, you didn't provide it error. But it's nice in that you can bounce up and down the hierarchy like that. But you have to be aware of something called service shadowing. So here we have the location service and HTTP, and notice that the app module I decided to provide a foo, right? But then for some strange reason, I decided to provide a different implementation of it at the next level. And then I did it again, all right? And so Fox wants a foo. All right, and what it's going to get is foo3. It'll never see the other ones. So they're effectively shadowed. Now, this is sometimes undesirable, or it's sometimes exactly what you want. And we're going to see later that this is going to be something that's exactly what we want. But it's important to know that it exists. Did I hit the right button? Okay. So let's go back to that registration thing. Now that we know that we could find it by having it bubble up, we have our parent animal container. We have the Fox component inject the animal container, the parent, and it calls register on that container. And then the animal container holds a bunch of references. So when the registration happens, it says, thank you, I'm glad to know about Fox, dog, cat, Viking, and so forth. And I put it in the animals. And then I iterate over it when somebody presses the speak button, and I tell each of the animals to speak. And this is great, just like a tab control, all right? Except it's not good for us, because it's really tight coupling. All of the foxes and dogs, they all have to know the name of their parent and know this whole protocol. But I didn't want to write the fox and the dog that way. I mean, it would work, but I don't want my fox, my dog, my Viking to know what container they belong to or have to belong to a single one. I couldn't subclass it. It's just too, right? I don't want this root. It works. It works great for tab controls. It's not going to work for us. So we need a better solution. So what if we did a view children and we looked for the interface? Remember, my interface now is an abstract class, so it's going to be there. So I say, hey, content children, go get me all the animals. And I get nothing. I get nothing. I get nothing because content children cannot find a base class or an interface that's underneath any of your classes. In other words, it can find fox, it can find dog, it can find cat, but it doesn't know that they implement something else. Has no idea. So you get nothing. So this isn't working. Well, maybe what I could do is I could run around and I could mark all of the things that are being projected with an attribute directive. So I'll write myself an empty attribute directive. It doesn't really need to do anything. I just need to write it. I hope you've seen this or gone to the chapter on writing an attribute directive. And so I run around and I put those all on the ones that I think are animals. And I ask for that directive. And what do I get? I ask for directives, I get directives. What's in the directive? Nothing. What's it good for? Right now, nothing. I don't have any access to the component that the attribute is attached to. I am not getting any closer. All right, I'll try another trick. Let's mark them with a ref variable. You've seen ref variables before. Those pound things, that give you a reference to either the element or the component that's attached to it. And I do that, and it works great. Except I got rocks in there, and I got the paragraph in there, because if you look back there, I didn't put them on the right ones. That would never happen, right? Who would mess that up? I missed the dog. I missed the rock, and then, Now, I could sort of guard against that, but I can't do anything about the fact that I missed some. All right, well, you could say, hey, that's a programmer's problem, shrug, figure it out. And look, it's pretty easy, all right? So it should be in your bag of tricks, but maybe there's another way. Maybe there's a better way. How am I doing? Oh, right on schedule, I think. So I don't know about you folks. Did you know that content children and view children have a second parameter? Have you ever seen that brace read colon thing? Usually you see it with element ref. You said to yourself, what's that? I think what I'll do is I'll go to the API docs and find out about that. No, you don't. It ain't there. It hasn't been there from day one. I don't know why it's not there. You'll see examples of it all throughout the code. The way forms work desperately needs this read parameter. But you don't know what it is, and they don't tell you. So you go look in the code. Hey, I'm a good snooper. I snooped around in there. I still couldn't figure out what it did. All right. So I was just one of those many angular mysteries that we leave untouched for another day. I kept hoping that Pascal would write a blog post about what it is, but he let me down. You could fix that later. So anyway, I'm going to try it. I actually have learned what it does, and you're about to learn what it does. So let's go back to marking with a directive. And as you remember, it returned the directive, which wasn't terribly useful. All right, so we just did this a minute ago, but now we're going to go back and we're going to add read, and we're going to do what we have seen scattered around the code. We're going to throw element ref on there and see what that gives us. Okay. Hey, it's actually useful. What it gives us is direct access to the element that the directive is attached to. All right? What that means is that if we wanted to do something in our container where we manipulated the element, the dog element, the cat element, the Viking element, the DOM element, we could do so. And that's how we get that black border around there, all right? Because I get the element and I start tweaking it. I'm playing with the DOM. And in fact, a lot of attribute directives, this is how they manipulate the element that they're attached to. It's really a great technique. Doesn't happen to help us because we don't want to interact with the element. We want the cat component, the dog component, the Viking component, so we can ask them to speak. But it's a step. It's a step along the way. We're learning something. And it's also a useful trick for something else. So some fun facts. Every component instance has its own injector. We mentioned this at the top, but it's going to become important now. It's not a real injector because that would be inefficient. It's kind of a pseudo injector, but the way you interact with it is, it's as if it were. From a dependency injection perspective, it's as if each component had its own injector. Fun fact number one. Fun fact number two. The read parameter, yes, now we know what it does. Every time you use read, it says, oh, I guess you don't want the thing, the directive or whatever you look for. You want whatever's in that thing's own injector. Element ref is one of the things that's in that injector. That's why read element ref works. Fun fact number three. Every time you instantiate a component, every time you create a fox, a dog, a cat, a Viking, a rock, anything, Angular automatically puts it in the component's own injector. So we ought to be able to read that, yeah? So this actually works. I should be able to go to the, take the directive, put the read parameter on there, ask for the fox component, and yo, there it is. I get it. Of course, we saw this before when we just said, hey, screw that, I just want to go for the fox component directly. And that didn't do anything for us. Because, once again, it's only good for foxes. All right, it's crazy to do it for every single type, and the container shouldn't know anything about foxes or Vikings, or sorry, maybe it should know about Vikings, but it doesn't. All right, so read fox component isn't going to be the answer, but it's kind of on the way to an answer. We're going to do something called use existing. Now, I know that most of you, you're Angular developers, so you've learned to provide with a class. You've learned to use class. You've learned to use factory. But I bet that not many of you have used use existing. So now's the time to learn what that does. It's a way of aliasing. It's a way of getting a reference to some other service by its token. So if I have something called my alias and I use existing, it's a pointer to some other token, in this case some service, and that'll give me some service. So now my alias refers to some service, and so I can inject my alias. I don't have to inject some service. I inject my alias, and now I've actually got a reference to some service. Now, you got to be really careful with this because it's really easy to confuse use existing with use class. If you said use class, what you get is not a reference to the original some service. What you get is a brand new instance of some service associated with my alias. So now there are two instances of some service in the injector. And that can be a very subtle bug. It's going to be okay if it's a stateless service, but you can imagine if some service cached something, and you in one place had read some service and it cached a customer, and then you go use the my alias and you expect the customer to be there, it's not going to be there. Because it's in my alias's own private version of the some service, not the original. It's missing. So when you want to alias, you use existing. Now, my alias, and say, whichever one I inject, I'm really talking to the same instance of the service. All right. You say, really, do I need this? Hey, bear with me. We're almost there. Because we're going to use that trick, that fact of aliasing, to alias the component with its own interface. We're going to say, hey, Fox component, you are also an animal. And we do it like that. We put it right on the component. Okay? And because I provided it at the component level, there's going to be one instance of my animal in that injector. If I create another Fox component and I do the same thing, will it get confused? Why won't it? Because we have the hierarchy of injectors. Whatever level you provide at gets its own instance. So every instance of a fox, a dog, a cat, whatever, has its own injector with its own animal service referencing by aliasing the component itself. All right? Now you're just going to have to let that one settle in. All right? You're talking to yourself. Talking to yourself is usually a bad thing, but it's a good thing here. Okay, and so we do this to every one of the animal components. All right? So and by the way, when we think about this now, the Fox component doesn't know anything about a container. The one thing it does agree to say is, I know what an animal is, all right? So if anybody asks for animal, I'm an animal. That's all it's saying when we do this provide. No commitment to anything anywhere else. It's just a commitment to saying I'm an animal, which I'm happy to be. Now I go back to my directive thing, and instead I use the read again, and I say, well, the read looks inside the injector, and what's in there now? Animal. So when I do read animal, as you can see, it finds them all. And I now have access to the components through the directive by way of the read parameter. I have access to the components through the directive by way of the read. Finally I've got an answer to our question. And now I can ask the animals to speak because I got them. Here was my big surprise yesterday. I'm showing this presentation to Pascal, and he says, well, why don't you just ask about the animal? I said I did that earlier in the talk, and and you got nothing. I proved you get nothing. You can't ask a component for its base class. It won't work. And so I tried it, and it worked. It's very, very disturbing. So I booked a plane home, but I couldn't get one fast enough. It turns out this is actually a good thing. And it works now, and it's even better than I ever thought. Anyway, this is what I really want to do in the first place. I don't want to mark up anything. I don't want to create any directives. I don't want to put any items on there, and I don't want it to make a mistake. This is where I want to be. And it turns out that's going to work. Because now when I do content children, apparently, undocumented behavior. Apparently what it does, content children now looks into the injectors of everything that's in there. And because Fox implements animal, or provides it by alias, and dog does by alias, and Viking does by alias, because they all agreed to do that, because they do that, this time content children finds things when it looks for animals. Remember, it didn't before, now it does. There they are. That's a beautiful thing. Now I have a really simple pattern for how I'm going to find things, arbitrary things within a container. All I have to do is make sure that the things that want to participate, the things that want to be found, provide themselves under some interface that I pick, and then my container can just do that. And that is your big takeaway for my talk. So I have a little coda on it, a little extra thing, because I didn't talk about something about this content children that I think is important. That's that the query list, we've seen that the query list has a to-array on it. We've been using query list to array and elsewhere here. I don't have it on this slide. It's actually a live list. Query list is a live list. And in order to get the contents of it, you have to go to array to look at it. But it also has a changes property on it that you can subscribe to. Because way up high, those list items, they could come and they could go, right? And you want to know about those things because you want to update information that you have about those things, right? Perhaps you're keeping a live list about that. So in order to show that effect, naturally it went somewhere south. Where are you? Here, when you run this application, you'll notice it has the black border, and when I say, what do they say? It puts it in the black border. That was because I did that element ref example where we manipulated the element that I talked about a couple slides back. But what I deliberately didn't do was re-execute that logic when the list changes. So I have a little hide button here, and when I hide it, all of them go away. They're destroyed. The list has changed. The list is now empty. I click it again, the list is back. Ooh, but I didn't, when it came back, put the borders around. So now the borders are no longer there. It's just back to this. So when you look at the code, you'll be able to see how these things all tie together. But you can see the value and the importance of listening to the change list. And in this case, I deliberately didn't listen to the change list so that the original behavior disappears when things are restored. And if I go back. So that was my little bonus thing. The real fun thing was this. And I want to thank you for coming. You'll find the code in GitHub and the slides at this location. And our 30 minutes together, well actually 25 minutes and change are done, and I'll be standing on the side ready to have a conversation with whoever is interested.